Gary, we're going to pass this around as we speak.
Good afternoon. My name is Andy Schatz. I'm serving actually in 3 roles here today. I'm the chair of our social action committee here at the synagogue. I'm going to also be serving as the moderator, so to speak. And lastly, I am president of the American Civil Liberties Union of Connecticut, although I should point out that my remarks here are not made on behalf of, nor do they necessarily represent the views of the American Civil Liberties Union, or for that matter, the social action committee. I wanted to mention our Social Action Committee this year will be exploring various aspects of diversity and intolerance, racial, ethnic, and religious, over this coming year. Our vision for this first program was sort of as a baseline, as it were to look at anti-Semitism, especially here in Connecticut, what we might be able to do most effectively to combat it. The Social Action Committee intends to do a program in March that's going to be called Coming to America. It will focus on the immigrant experience, focusing on the current experience of the undocumented immigrants, but also connecting it to our own experience in the migrations that took place starting 100 years ago or even longer, and hopefully the experience of others, of our neighbors in these communities, and try to see what the similarities and differences are. We're also hoping this spring to do a program that will focus on racial profiling and Islamophobia, and another program that will focus on what can be done with the synagogue and the local churches to work on issues that we all have in terms of religious differences and some of the activities that take place that wittingly or unwittingly may cause pain to any of our community members. So we hope you will join us for those as well. Let me start by introducing my colleagues here. Gary Jones, on the right here, has for nearly 5 years been the regional director of the Anti-Defamation League at its office here in Connecticut. And before that, practiced law for many years. The Connecticut Regional Office, while he was its head, is the recipient of the FBI Director's Community Leadership Award in 2013. And for his work with the Anti-Defamation League, Gary was named one of the 15 movers and shakers in the Connecticut Jewish community by the Connecticut Jewish Ledger. He's also been active in many other charitable organizations. He will be leaving ADL at the end of this month, and we are especially pleased to have him here in one of his last appearances, I'm sure, officially for the ADL, but we also hope he will join us at later programs as well. Goldenberg, as I'm sure all of you know, has been our rabbi here at the Congregation Beth-Shalom Representative for 7 years. He's an active member and former co-chair of TRUA, the organization formerly known as Rabbis for Human Rights North America. And most importantly, as those of us who have worked with her know, or those of us who've listened to her sermons, she is a vigorous and tireless personal advocate for the cause of human rights both locally and around the world. We'll each take about 5 or 10 minutes and talk about the subject, and then we'll have a series of questions we may talk about internally, but we're also going to open it up to questions from the audience. And starting that
Shabbat Shalom. It is Shabbat, which is a wonderful time to talk about human rights. And I actually see my role here as framing the discussion from a Jewish standpoint. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the organization that I've been a part of for a long time, about TRUA. First of all, TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, is an organization of 1,800 rabbis and cantors from all denominations of Judaism, from Reconstructionist to Reform to Conservative to Renewal to some Orthodox across the country. And we actually, as an organization, invented this idea of Human Rights Shabbat, which is what we're observing today. That one Shabbat per year, synagogues really should be focusing on the issue of human rights. And so there are more than 100 other congregations doing this across the country this weekend. This weekend being, I didn't look up the exact date of Human Rights Day, but it is this week. And that day marks the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights being adopted by the United Nations. So that's why I'm really pleased that we're doing a program today. And I just want to talk a little bit about our organization, and then I'll get to the Jewish underpinnings of why we care about human rights. Truah brings, I'm reading from our mission statement, we bring together rabbis and cantors from all streams of Judaism, together with all members of the Jewish community, to act on the Jewish imperative to respect and advance the human rights of all people. Grounded in Torah and our Jewish historical experience, and guided by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we call upon Jews to assert Jewish values by raising our voices and taking concrete steps to protect and expand human rights in North America, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territories. So that's, in a nutshell, who we are and what we do. So what is this Jewish imperative, then, to advance the human rights of all people? Where does that come from in our sacred tradition, in our texts? It really flows from the most foundational message that the Torah gives us from the very first chapter of Genesis, that the first human being was created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And it's interesting, it was a human being, or an earthling, you can think of it, that was both male and female. So equality of gender in the first telling of the creation story in the Torah, not in the second telling with Adam and Eve, okay? At the first telling, man and woman are created in one being simultaneously, and that is considered b'tselem Elohim, the image of God. So go think about what that says about God, too, okay, in terms of gender. But later texts in our tradition build on this teaching that we're in the divine image. In the Midrash, we read that one who sheds blood is regarded as though he had diminished the image of God. Okay, so taking a life diminishes God. Right? And one who destroys a single soul is considered as having destroyed an entire world. There's this idea that the first human was created alone so that no human could claim superior ancestry to another. So that's where the idea of equality of all people comes from. All right, if we all are descended from the same ancestor, none of us can say we're better. And that when you destroy a soul, you're destroying an entire world. Right? We all have infinite value. We're also taught to learn to empathize with and love the stranger, the marginalized, the other, because of our historical experience. So here you can hear, I'm already talking about the other. I'm not talking about anti-Semitism, right? But we include ourselves in this. We hopefully love ourselves enough and value ourselves enough to recognize that as Jews we are created in the divine image and we are equal to all, and we need to take care of ourselves and love ourselves, right? And from that flows an understanding that the other must be loved. So in Leviticus, we're told to treat the citizen and the non-citizen alike. That's from a standpoint of Jews having power to determine how we're going to treat non-citizens, right? But these days, besides the state of Israel, we aren't necessarily in charge as Jews, right? But we advocate for that value, that citizens and non-citizens alike need to be treated the same. Throughout our history, we know intimately the dangers of being singled out for our difference in who we are, in how we look, or in the faith we practice. So, this mandate to pursue human rights for all people comes from our historical experience. We, as Jews, have experienced torture, exploitation, slavery, expulsion, and so that motivates us to definitely take care of our own and to reach beyond ourselves and protect others from that same experience. So in terms of Truah and our campaigns, and I'll end with this, just want to give you a sense of what we're working on. And we don't have in our mission combating anti-Semitism per se. That is not our mission. That we're going to hear from Gary about. So I'm talking about, how then does this Jewish imperative to protect human rights, what does that look like in our activism that we do for others? One is a campaign fighting Islamophobia. And I think this campaign really embodies those Jewish values that I was just talking about really beautifully. So I'll just go into detail on this one. In the fall of 2012, a noted anti-Muslim blogger, Pamela Geller, you may remember, was running ads on transit systems around the country in New York City and Washington, which read, "In the choice between the civilized man and the savage, choose civilization. Support Israel, defeat jihad." So these are seemingly pro-Israel ads, right? But what they're doing is equating Islam with savagery and implying that all Muslims support jihad and indicate that the only way to support Israel is to be at war with Muslims. It sets up this us-them dynamic. That's what it does. And the Jewish community really united in rejection of these ads. We were the only Jewish group that took out counter ads. And so we put up ads in the subways that said, "In the choice between love and hate, choose love. Help stop bigotry against our Muslim neighbors." So that's an example of how we try to live out those values. We have a campaign against prolonged solitary confinement, which is an extension of our anti-torture work, which we've been doing for many years. We have a campaign against slavery and human trafficking. We fight displacement of Bedouin citizens of Israel and the expulsion and displacement of Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And we're currently working, along with many, many others, to end police brutality and racial profiling, and to pursue equality in the justice system for all Americans. So that's who we are, what we do, and why we do it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. I want to say that I'm very honored to be here with Andy and Rabbi Goldenberg, and I also want to say how much I enjoyed the service that I attended with the congregation this morning. Thank you very much for being so welcoming and for making it such a beautiful Shabbat for me. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about ADL, and then what Andy has suggested that I do is sort of talk a little bit about the scenario involving anti-Semitism in Connecticut and a little bit more broadly. But first, I think it's important to understand how ADL comes at these issues. There's a lot of similarities, particularly in the mission of ADL, to the way Rabbi talked about Truah. Think about the Jewish experience in America and how different it has been from so many of the experiences of Jews throughout the history of the world. Jews mostly, who came to this country, of course, mostly left in the early stages Europe, and they left civilizations where the identity of citizenship was very much tied with a specific church. It was really virtually impossible in most areas for Jews to really be citizens and equally viewed by the public because they weren't viewed as equal citizens by the societies in which they lived. You come to America, and from the very beginning, our Bill of Rights, George Washington attended the first synagogue in Newport and sent a beautiful letter making it clear when they thanked him, he sent them back a letter saying, well, our country is different. Our country doesn't only tolerate the existence of people who are different from us. Our country welcomes difference and appreciates difference and views you as equal citizens to everyone else. You have to behave appropriately as citizens, as everyone else does, but if you do, you're like everyone else. You don't need to beg for acceptance. We will ensure your acceptance. That's an incredibly powerful message that the Jewish community got in the very beginning of our country. And that has made our country so different still from most other areas of the world. It's really phenomenal difference. One of the things that unfortunately began to be clear, even though Jews could practice their religion in the United States freely. And even though there was a lot of liberty for Jews, comparatively speaking, that didn't mean that hate went away. It was almost a little alarming for the Jewish community when you think about that. They could be free to practice their religion, they could earn a living, but that didn't necessarily result in freedom from hate. And that's why the ADL ultimately was developed. It was developed in 1913. It was founded because there was a recognition that Jews needed a voice, Jews needed protection. But what's really interesting, and this is where ADL very much mirrors Truah, it wasn't founded as an organization that simply looked out for Jews. From its very date, it has the same mission statement it does today, and that is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. There was a recognition from the very beginning of ADL that if you cared about one group of people, in our society you also had to care about everyone else. And so from day one through today, ADL has had this very bifurcated mission, essentially to fight hate of all kinds, whoever the target is, and whoever is the source of that hate. So that's why there's so much relationship between ADL and Truah and so many of the other good organizations that, including ACLU, that ADL regularly works with. But it's really important to recognize, I think also, that when you look at that mission, it didn't come out of whole cloth. It sprung very much from Jewish values. The one that I think about when I try to explain how ADL does its job is to think of the sage Hillel. He had the three-pronged test. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not, now when? And so that is the basis upon which ADL was founded and sort of explains what ADL tries to do. So without going into too much detail, ADL has a very wide variety of efforts to try to fight hate. And again, it does it no matter who the victim of that hate is. So now I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about some basic issues about anti-Semitism in Connecticut and in our country. First of all, I have a few handouts out there for you to take when you go home. The three things that I have are, one, talking about our survey of anti-Semitic, global survey of anti-Semitic attitudes. It was the first effort to make a relatively comprehensive global survey in 102 countries of people's perspectives on Jews. And probably not surprisingly, but still unhappily, there's a lot of different components to it, and I really encourage you to look at the full survey at adl.org. But what it ultimately talks about is it asked 11 specific questions to try to measure anti-Semitic attitudes. And before someone was deemed to be on the side of anti-Semitism, that person had to actually answer the anti-Semitic perspective for 6 of the 11 questions. So it was a pretty high bar. And the survey showed that on a global basis of all the people surveyed, fully 26% of the people hold anti-Semitic attitudes. Again, it's measured by the responses to a minimum of 6 of those 11 questions. Interestingly, when we do surveys in Europe and the United States, which we've done for a much longer period of time, the threshold is not so high. You don't need to have 6 for people to assume that that's an anti-Semitic perspective. If the bar was 5 questions as opposed to 6, the numbers would have gone up from 26% to 32%. Point is, we know there are a lot of folks who have anti-Semitic attitudes internationally, thankfully much less so, clearly, in our country and in other areas, particularly of the Americas, have much lower level of anti-Semitism. In Connecticut and nationally, we actually try to, we can't really do this totally effectively, but we try to measure the number of anti-Semitic incidents that occur. Not attitudes, but actual incidents. Swastikas that are targeting Jews, because ADL won't even view a standalone swastika as necessarily an anti-Semitic incident. It's obviously hateful, But if we don't have evidence that it's directed specifically at Jews, it doesn't go into the count. So one of the things that we have here is a press release about our anti-Semitic incident count in Connecticut. And the numbers are difficult, but we don't want to draw too much attention to the specific numbers. We do these measures every year, and the trends are what we tend to look at. And again, I won't spend too much time talking about it, but the press release also talks about specific incidents that have happened in Connecticut over the last year. And some are frankly troubling. There are some that are physical assaults, thanks, and there are some that really very, very threatening in ways that are a little disconcerting. The final thing that I want to talk about is that there was another measure for anti-Semitism in our country. The FBI does hate crime statistics. So these are, you can engage in an anti-Semitic act that is not necessarily illegal, but the FBI obviously only deals in things that are illegal. And it keeps track of hate crimes targeting African Americans, members of multiple religions, or anything where a person is targeted for a crime that is based on gender, orientation, race, religion, etc. One of the things that few people recognize, even in our own community, that when you look at the hate crime statistics applicable to religious organizations, to people who are members of religion, in other words, people are targeted because of the religion, fully 62% of those people so targeted are Jews. That's a statistic that most in our community have no idea about, and it's relatively constant. It's always in the, the low to mid 60s on a year-to-year basis. So while it is our job as Jews, and certainly my job as someone who's with ADL, to worry about everybody and to stand up for everybody, we can't miss what's happening, even in our own country, where we are safer and more secure than any place else in the world.
Thank you. Let me start by just saying that it's interesting. I think that the American Civil Liberties Union actually, interestingly enough, shares a tremendous amount with both the ADL and TRUA. And part of that stems from, as Gary described it, sort of the origin of most folks who are in this country, came from somewhere else, came at a time where they were among a minority group. And back at the time that the Declaration of Independence was put together, it basically was recognized that what had happened was a group that had originally left to escape a tremendous amount of intolerance of their religious beliefs were concerned that they saw that the King of England had not been tolerant of the beliefs that had developed in a number of ways. They wanted to make sure that they set up a government that was tolerant. The Declaration of Independence set that, and then of course, over the next 15 years, as they tried to put together a government, they moved a little bit away from it, but they made sure when they put together the Constitution that there was a Bill of Rights that tried to put in writing those basic principles that had led to so many people leaving Europe to move here, so many people coming together with the Declaration of Independence, and finally deciding that they needed to make sure that those principles were there as part of the base of the government. The American Civil Liberties Union started in 1920, following the First World War, at a time when there was a lot of government activity that was basically going to try to restrain individual rights. And so the organization for the last 100 years has had no goal other than to preserve the rights and protect the rights that are in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution, guaranteed to individuals to be free from repression from their government. And so it enacts a series of of measures, if you will, that encourages, embraces diversity, embraces the concept that unless folks are hurting somebody else, they ought to be left to do what they would do. Part of that is the First Amendment, free speech. And I'm happy to get into details about the law with respect to that. But I think most importantly, for purposes of the discussion, is that the principle behind it is that we are going to be a better nation, we are going to be a more tolerant nation, we're going to be a more productive nation if we embrace all of the ideas and let the best ideas emerge. And so there is in the First Amendment, the notion that that you will not restrict thoughts, not restrict expression, except under very rare circumstances. And I think more importantly, that policy is also the policy that I think is the right policy for us to have in terms of making sure that we truly protect rights of minorities, including the Jewish community. Interestingly enough, I saw something this week that commented that within a fairly short number of years, Protestantism in the United States will be a minority religion. And I think what's interesting is at that point, we can truly say that everybody in this country is a minority. And I think that that's really what the Bill of Rights was meant to do. That's what the American Civil Liberties Union tries to do. And I'll say from our Social Action Committee standpoint, we recently had a discussion where basically we'd had as one of our categories, we had said tolerance. And we basically said, who wants to be tolerated? That's not the goal. The goal is to embrace diversity. The goal is to recognize that we all do better, that ultimately we are all more protected if we go out and affirmatively go out and embrace diversity. For those of us who are football fans, the best defense is a good offense. And so happy to take questions on any of these things, but I think that that's really where we're coming at, both from the standpoint of the American Civil Liberties Union, from the standpoint of social action here, and I think it's really very consistent. There are some areas of detail which we'll get into where, being consistent with the Constitution, we may upset people, do upset people in particular positions and particular issues, and we'll talk about that. So let's open it up and have free to ask any questions. I know, Rabbi, you had said during the service today that you had one for us, but I wanted to, if I could, kick it off. I wanted to try to serve as a baseline, sort of figure out what is anti-Semitism. And here we're using it. Really, it could be the same thing as other racial, racism type positions, and in fact, we'll see that there are some similarities. But just as an example, for those of you who haven't seen or studied the ADL survey, some of the 11 questions focus on things like a statement that says Jews have too much power in the business world, or Jews have too much power in international financial markets, Jews have too much control over the US government or the global media. And I think that those are very interesting. I want to have sort of an understanding of why it is that is an anti-Semitic indicator. Particularly if you were to take, just as an example, I think that it may in fact be a fact or not, but certainly is probably perceived that if you looked at the number of Jewish individuals in business, it probably is a higher percentage compared to their total overall percentage than percentage of other, of other religions. To me, that still doesn't make this. So I still understand the statement is anti-Semitic, but I want Gary to really comment on it, because I think that's key to understanding what this measure is.
So I don't pretend to be an expert on each of the questions of the survey. Those surveys have been prepared over a long period of time by people whose job it is to do surveys and measure things. But I think Andy's question is a good one, and I'm going to try to answer it as best I can without pretending to be an expert on the survey. One of the things that has been apparent in anti-Semitism is that folks tend to group Jews together and believe that there is a monolithic Jew who very often in the anti-Semitic perspective thinks nefarious thoughts for the betterment of Jews and for the detriment of everyone else. So that's been a historical perspective. That's the protocols of the elders of Zion. I mean, so many of the horribly anti-Semitic tracts and perspectives sort of are based on that. And many of the stuff that you still read today, unfortunately, in much of the world where anti-Semitism is much more prevalent and much more accepted than it is in our country. So just dealing with that specific question, one of the things I would ask people to do is to substitute another group for Jew and say, would that seem okay to you? So for instance, there may be more Jews, say in the movie industry, disproportionately than others. But there are other industries where there are more Protestants, other industries where there are more Catholics, and other industries, hopefully increasingly, where there are more Muslims. It's not a question and it's not a narrative that tends to resonate with other groups. So that's the first thing. It's a question they probably wouldn't be asked or wouldn't be thought of for other groups. The second way that I look at that is to help understand why it's very problematical is again, there may be a higher percentage of Jews proportionally, say again in the movie industry, but they're not acting as Jews. They're acting as individuals in the same way that every person has the right to act as an individual, no matter what the race, religion, orientation is. And so the idea that there are too many suggests that there is, again, this cabal involved among the members of the Jewish community in doing their movie business. It's silly, and ultimately is a manifestation of bigotry.
The question makes me think it's very interesting because so often in the Jewish community we will express pride that, wow, that guy is Jewish, right? That guy that made that movie, or, oh look, the person who just invented that, he's Jewish, right? That's a very different thing from saying the Jews have too much power in X, Y, or Z, right? So it's this faceless, nameless glob, right? That have too much power. The other thing that makes me think about, I had a good friend who was a Pakistani Muslim in college, and a dear friend, and we were studying Marx. We went to Columbia where we had to, we read Marx. And this person who at that point I'd known for 2 years, he'd come to Passover Seders, he had come to my house, met my rabbi father, come to Shabbat services with me, was friends with the campus rabbi, okay? We're reading Marx, and he says to me, well, Jews do control the world economy. Right? So that's the difference. He knows me, right? He knows rabbis, he knows Judaism, yet there's this attitude that was taught to him by his society that was really deeply ingrained. No matter how many Jews he had met at Columbia University, and he had met many, he still maintained that attitude. And I don't blame him necessarily for having it, but that's when I think of what is anti-Semitism, it's an irrational, not really in touch with reality, projection of a fear of the group that is anti-Semitic onto Jews, whom they don't know. They're not real. We are not real. In that statement to say, the Jews have too much power, they're not talking about real Jews.
So let me just ask you, how do we address that? There you go.
Yeah. So this is how we address it. This is what ABL thinks about all the time. One of the things that I think, as the rabbi just illustrated beautifully, is that what people learn matters. there are consequences to being taught to hate that don't majestically disappear, even in the context of her Pakistani-American friend who knew her, clearly liked, Pakistani friend, who knew her and knew her family and liked them. Hate matters. We live in a world where many millions of people are routinely taught to hate others. Jews very often at the top of the list, but it's certainly not exclusively Jewish as being targets. I really think we in our country work very hard. I mean, ADL, everybody works hard to fight against hate, and that's one of the reasons that even though there is bigotry and God knows hate hasn't gone away, relatively speaking, it's not the same as it is in many other parts of the world. But I really do believe that if we don't recognize, I mean, it's funny, we talk about a war on terror. You know, terror is a manifestation of a bigger problem. Terror doesn't exist on itself. Terror is a way to achieve a political gain. The problem is that we have too much hate in the world, and when you have too much hate, you have dehumanization of people, and when you frankly are taught that other people's lives don't have value, then anything is okay. And so, this is an ADL issue, this is all of our issues, but I wish it would be more of a governmental issue, because I think that is the depths with which we need to approach the problem of finding a way to make countries and governments and others who either regularly teach hate or regularly accept the teaching of hate among its population as a problem that we need to deal with. We all talk about our desire for peace. It's going to be hard to get peace in our modern society with technology and weapons